My friends, the desertion crisis of our beloved Ukrainskaya Armia is worse than I thought. Do you remember how in fall 2024, Ukraine sent an entire brigade to be trained in France? They would get NATO training and they would be fully equipped by the French military. Everything looked very promising.
And it's gone.
Here from Forbes, Ukraine's newest Leopard 2 brigade began disintegrating before it reached the front line. From the Telegraph, flagship Ukrainian brigade trained in France goes AWOL.
A unit is running from the battlefield. A shameful display!
I made an entire video about the training program of this brigade. However, I was extremely skeptical at the end result of this experiment. This leads me to believe that Task Force Champagne only took care of the technical aspect of the training mission, meaning they only formed the mechanized battalions and the artillery component. Meanwhile, the remaining 2,200 soldiers, so the entire second half of the brigade, well, they all trained in Ukraine. Then this entire training mission was dumb and useless. It was all for nothing. Just yet another PR stunt. I don't want to sound pessimistic, but I'm worried for these guys. The Ukrainians will just fill in the gaps with men they snatched off the streets, and the quality of the brigade will just crash. And guess what? It was indeed a disaster. It's not a surprise considering what I learned about this brigade during my research. Essentially, hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers from the 155th Mechanized Brigade deserted before even deploying to combat. In this article by Ukrainian journalist Yuri Butusov, we read, "Before the brigade fired the first shot, 1,700 soldiers left it voluntarily."
This is madness.
And that was at the end of November. And in December, the brigade witnessed yet again a couple more hundreds of deserters. It keeps going up, and those are only the official figures. Reality is probably much higher. Now, unlike what many people say online, I would highlight the fact that it's not the fault of the French army's training. I mean, just listen to the wisdom that Combat Betterment Paul shared on his YouTube channel. You can't count on the French, but you can always count on the French to be French. And when they got assigned to train a Ukrainian brigade, well, it seems like they may have dropped the ball.
And I thought my jokes were bad.
This is such a ridiculous statement because this story of desertion is not an isolated case in the AFU. Put simply, 97% of the Ukrainian soldiers that deserted from the 155th were not the ones that trained in France, but the ones that were trained in Ukraine. Remember what Arestovich, the former advisor of President Zelensky, said in July about the situation in Taretsк.
Могу вам привести случай. На одном из ключевых участков фронта позавчера 6 батальонов отказались выполнять боевую задачу. Соседних. 6. Вы думаете, это единственный случай? Вы думаете, такого не будет повторяться? Вы думаете, это не будет идти по нарастающей? Это не так. Несмотря на всю западную помощь и так далее. Потому что в корне лежит неправильное отношение к людям. И люди платят что? Нелояльностью.
This desertion crisis is a systemic issue in the armed forces of Ukraine that we can witness all across the front. We're talking about 100 to 200,000 deserters. If you're interested in the story, I made an entire video about it. In reality, France fully fulfilled all the obligations on arming and training the brigade that the Ukrainians demanded. The problem clearly comes from Ukraine's general staff and its poor management of manpower. Here, this Ukrainian MP wrote, "The French tried to make the brigade specialized, but did not save it from the stupid military decisions of our generals and tore the unit apart." So in this video, we will analyze the entire situation from the beginning, so that you can get the full picture of what happened to the French-trained 155th Mechanized Brigade. Spoilers, we even have a testimony of one of the deserters of this brigade. Welcome to HistoryLegends, and here are the latest news of the Russo-Ukrainian War. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. As you know, some of my videos have been targeted with limited or no ads. So make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal to keep the show running. Thank you to everyone that has already helped, and welcome to the headquarters. So you remember how in March 2024, the General Staff of Ukraine announced the creation of yet another brigade. The new one would be the 155th. It was to be commanded by Dmytro Ryumshin, the former commander of the 47th Mechanized Brigade. However, since there were no heavy weapons for the formation, it was labeled as 155th Infantry Brigade. So President Zelensky came up with a plan to involve Ukraine's NATO allies to form 14 new brigades. The idea was for Ukraine to provide the military personnel, and for NATO partners to find all the necessary equipment. The French military took the lead of this project. That's how the 155th Infantry Brigade was relabeled as 155th Mechanized Brigade and given the name Anne de Kiev in honor of symbolic historical ties between France and Ukraine. In September 2024, the brigade went for intensive training in France, mostly to learn how to use all these new French weapons and vehicles. From the outside, everything looked promising. Now, despite the fact that I was limited by open source information, I could already see the cracks in the narrative. Like I said, I made an entire video about it if you're interested. Since then, new information was released to the public, and now we have the complete picture of this shipwreck. First of all, Zelensky's PR stunt cost Ukraine 900 million euros, and 80% of the cost was to pay for the heavy weapons like tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery pieces. So it wasn't free help, but that wasn't the worst. You will understand why in a minute. Although the 155th Brigade was officially created in March 2024, recruitment only began in June and recruits started undergoing basic training. That's how the brigade grew extremely fast over the summer. That's when the drama of this entire story started. You see, it was Operational Command West that was responsible for the creation of this brigade. The moment the brigade had gathered a sizable force, between July and August, more than 2,500 personnel from the 155th Mechanized Brigade were taken away to replenish other units. The General Staff of Ukraine effectively pillaged the brigade from all its manpower, only for the 155th to act like an organ donor for the entire Ukrainian army. Ukrainian media tsn.ua wrote, "They took almost all the fully qualified personnel from the brigade, whom the brigade commander and combat units had just assigned to positions, effectively nullifying all the previous 4 months of work."
Madness and stupidity.
All the soldiers, but also most of the command structure, just vanished, bringing the brigade back to square one. Even worse, during these chaotic times, the brigade already reported over 750 deserters. In response, can you guess what the General Staff did? That's right, they gathered a fresh new batch of men snatched from the streets and bussified them into the ranks of the 155th. What could possibly go wrong? Now we're in August. Slowly, the new mobilized personnel are going through basic training. In September, the men of the 155th and the Kiev Brigade were told that they would be sent to France for training, to get a really good grasp at the BBC waiting for them there. A very thorough battalion and brigade course. Now, to be honest, as you could see, brigade is a very strong word. The formation that was sent for training in the camp of Mourmelon was far from an organized military structure whose elements could learn a lot. It was simply a crowd, a pack of tired men in army fatigues. Overall, that's how 1,924 Ukrainian soldiers ended up in a training camp in northeastern France. Of these 1,900, only 51 had combat experience and had been in the army for more than a year. We can't believe these guys ended up being the actual instructors. Another 459 men had served for less than 12 months. The majority, 1,414 people, had been mobilized less than 2 months prior. A batch drafted throughout the summer as replacements for the 155th. Even worse, 150 of them had just been snatched off the streets a couple days before and did not even go through basic training. From what I understood, only 30% of the COs necessary were present, and the officers didn't even know each other. So to fill in the positions on the Excel spreadsheet, many of the rank and file were promoted at random. Radio Free Europe interviewed one of these deserters of the 155th, and he told them, "Since I have a higher education, I was immediately awarded the rank of junior officer." And that's how he was appointed platoon commander of an engineering unit. He also stated that COs like him did not go through basic training, meaning he would not even get to learn how to use a weapon or how to navigate a trench network. Not surprisingly, he admitted that he wasn't feeling ready at all to lead a group of 30 men right into battle. That's when his superiors told him, "Don't worry, you will be sent to France for training." When doing my initial research on the 155th Mechanized Brigade, I naturally had to go through a lot of French language sources, and I stumbled upon certain comments on various YouTube videos. Now there were rumors from French people living in the vicinity of the camp of Mourmelon that Ukrainian military police kept chasing after deserters day and night across the forests. Honestly, I didn't believe it, because it was just some random comment. Turns out, it was true. During the French training mission, more than 50 Ukrainian soldiers deserted. Most of them came from the batch that had just been recently bussified into the military. To put things into perspective, that's 2.65% of all the soldiers that were sent to France for training. A deserter told Radio Free Europe that the French military camp looked more like an open-air prison. The territory where we lived was completely fenced off. The French walked around with dogs. Drones were launched over this territory at night. The fence was with barbed wire. Honestly, if we weren't being watched, like in prison, half of us would have escaped. In other words, we can say that the French army prevented the complete brigade from deserting right on the spot. Anyway, during one of those nights, our deserter friend took his chance and escaped. Meanwhile, there were no official statements from the French army, but we can believe all these desertions raised questions about Ukraine's strategy to fill in the ranks. The French officers must have thought that these Ukrainian mobilized personnel have not even suffered a single casualty and they're already trying to escape. What is it going to be like on a battlefield? Now we get to the big scam of the 155th Mechanized Brigade. As you know, the theoretical strength of a Ukrainian brigade is about 5,000 men. Yet, in the media, it was announced that roughly 2,000 Ukrainian soldiers would be sent for training in France. Honestly, at first I didn't think anything of it because that's the actual size of many Ukrainian brigades these days. But while digging, I found something interesting. That there was a second part of the brigade that was being trained in Ukraine. And that's when I knew Ukraine effed up. So the entire second half of the brigade, well, they all trained in Ukraine. Then this entire training mission was dumb and useless. It was all for nothing. Just yet another PR stunt. In the end, it's just yet another Ukrainian mechanized brigade, but with French equipment. I don't want to sound pessimistic, but I'm worried for these guys. The General Staff of Ukraine decided to fill in the ranks of the 155th Mechanized Brigade with, you guessed it, 4,000 freshly mobilized personnel. So now you had Team A training in France and Team B training in Ukraine. Actually, let me show you the full breakdown. Effective strength of the 155th on the left and official number of desertions on the right. The total amounts to 1,726 desertions over the lifespan of the brigade, from March to November. This is also what Yuri Butusov complained when he made this video that went viral. It's also interesting to see that about 10% of the total number of military personnel deserted every month, which is approximately the same rate we can see across the entire front. Overall, while 50 soldiers deserted from the component training in France, or 2.65%, we can see that the component training in Ukraine reported another 924 desertions between September and November, out of this contingent of 4,000 men. That's 25%. It's huge. And remember, those are only the official figures. So you cannot blame the French army's training for all these desertions. Starting on the 15th of November 2024, the rank and file that trained in Mourmelon began returning to Ukraine. But the brigade's headquarters remained another 2 weeks for extra training for which their French instructors gave them the highest marks. Once again, everything looked promising. Yet, during those 2 weeks of absence of the brigade's commander, Operational Command West once again plundered, pillaged the 155th Mechanized Brigade from both its human and material resources. They completely dismembered the battalions that the French army had carefully built, dispatching manpower and armored vehicles left and right across the front. Apparently, the Milan anti-tank squads that the French had trained for weeks were transferred to rifle companies.
This is absolute madness.
When Brigadier General Ryumshin and the headquarters finally returned to France, they were horrified to see what had become of their brigade. It had effectively disappeared, and not only that, now they had to deal with an extra mass of 3,000 to 4,000 poorly motivated mobics. Ryumshin immediately worked to get back control and salvage what he could from this formation. Within a few days, he had already managed to sort through this chaos. That's when the General Staff of Ukraine blamed him for the desertion of 50 people in France. And you know what? Because of that, he was removed from his post, as well as several staff officers and battalion commanders. Do you understand how ridiculous this is? What about the other 1,700 deserters? Let me reassure you, the commander of the Operational Command West, the true responsible of this entire mess, well, he's still in position to this day. Oh, but of course, it's the fault of the French army. One sensible option would have been to promote commanding officers of the brigade and take one of the battalion commanders, for example, and promote him to brigade commander. Nope, we're in Ukraine. Ryumshin was replaced by Colonel Taras Maximus, general of the armies of the north, former commander of the 14th Mechanized Legion. Loyal servant to the true emperor, wrong movie. Effectively, by early December, the Kiev Brigade that France had formed was no more. All the training and advice provided by the French army was just thrown out of the window. Meanwhile, the brigade servicemen that remained in the 155th became hostages of Zelensky's PR project.
Fuck.
Technically, I could stop the story here. But you know what? I can't, because it gets worse. The new commanders that were appointed didn't know anyone under them. And apparently none of them had any type of combat experience either. As a result, command and control fell to the ground. Due to all this chaos, in the first week of December, another 198 soldiers deserted from the brigade, effectively bringing the total to 2,000 desertions. At this point, the 155th Mechanized Brigade was just a shadow of its former self. Only a mass of riflemen that did not even want to be there. All the weapon specialists had to be trained from scratch. Barely any vehicles to be reported. You get the picture. The General Staff then sent several instructors from the 10th Mountain Brigade Edelweiss to make soldiers out of this mass of mobigs. Despite their best efforts and a quick crash course, these instructors could only express their doubts on the combat capability of the 155th Mechanized Brigade. The biggest weakness of this brigade was the lack of UAV operators. On paper, 6 UAV platoons were attached to every mechanized battalion, plus a separate UAV battalion of 3 companies. In reality, the brigade could only gather 150 drones, of which 137 Mavic 3s. That's nothing. You can see how many drones are used on a daily basis in Ukraine. That's like sending a rifleman for an assault with only 1 magazine. This means the 155th Mechanized Brigade would go into battle with no means of reconnaissance, which is essential to conduct modern warfare. Naturally, the lack of drones would deeply affect command and control. To make things even worse, according to the report of Butusov, the brigade also faced a complete lack of electronic warfare capabilities. The 155th Mechanized Brigade was not ready for combat. Despite what all the instructors and external observers said, someone up in the hierarchy put pressure to mark this unit as fit for duty. That's how a certain Colonel Hamilsky hastily dispatched the units to the front, without even giving them proper time to prepare. If that's not criminal, I don't know what it is. Because of that, there was no time to equip armored vehicles with the necessary protection, such as cages and explosive reactive armor. There was also a problem with the artillery component. The 120mm mortar shells produced by the Ministry of Strategic Planning and Industry turned out to be defective. On December 4, during test firing, not a single one of 10 shells exploded. This means the mortar crews could not provide fire support. Knowing Ukrainian management skills, these guys were probably transferred to rifle companies. I also read reports that the General Staff of Ukraine actually tricked France, as they never intended to keep this brigade united. It was just a big scheme to get more weapons from the West. Let's just say that France will rethink twice before repeating the experiment. The tragedy of it all, instead of deploying these guys in a calm sector for these mobilized personnel to get acclimatized to the realities of war, nope, they were sent right into the furnace. No surprise, that's what the Ukrainian army always does. In December, there was evidence that elements of the 155th Mechanized Brigade had been transferred to the front. Here we see Leopard 2A4 tanks being transported to Pokrovsk. That's where the 155th got its baptism of fire, the hottest sector in Ukraine. We don't have much information as to what happened on the front, but I'll share with you what I heard from various sources. Ukrainian journalist Butusov emphasized that the soldiers of the 155th Mechanized Brigade performed their duties with the highest merit, but with high losses due to the lack of combat experience. Here from the 25th of December, we see a burnt VAB in the Kurakhove sector. In this one, another VAB that got heavily damaged. And in this footage from the 29th of December, we see a destroyed AMX-10 RC, also from the Kurakhove sector. Not only were these poor Mobiks sent to the Pokrovsk front, they were sent right into this freaking collapsing pocket. Because of all this drama, eventually we learned that Ukraine launched a criminal probe into the 155th. Apparently Zelensky emphasized that he is taking the investigation under personal control. But according to some rumors, I hear that the blame will be shifted on Brigadier General Ryumshin, and not the actual people responsible for this entire mess. According to the latest news, the General Staff claims they have reinforced the 155th Brigade with unmanned units. That's the best definition of too little, too late. Hopefully the AFU can learn from this and improve things. But I fear that the window of opportunity is quickly closing. That's all I have for you today. Let me know in the comment section what you thought of my analysis. If you're new to this channel, make sure to like and subscribe. And if you want to support my work, make sure to check out my Patreon or PayPal. The links are in the description below.